Hey everybody, this is Ashley with Hill Shadows, and today I'm gonna read a story that my husband's grandfather always told to him as a child, and he's talked about it before on the show, but I'm just gonna read a little more into it after he had spoke with his father about it to try to get a little more detail. But yeah, so here we go. As a child, I would spend many weekends in the hills of eastern Kentucky, particularly Clay County, close to the border of Owsley County. You see, my father grew up in these hills, and my grandparents lived here their entire lives. Regularly, on our visits to see my grandparents, my grandfather, Ed, would tell me stories of strange things he and others had encountered in these dark hills over the years. Tales of ghosts or haunted places no one would dare to go. I was always fascinated by these tales, but one would always stick with me through the years. It was a story my grandfather would tell me about a night he was out with one of his good friends, Milton. Late that afternoon, my grandfather and Milton got a hankering to get some good old moonshine, and it was readily available, as this was one of the few ways these folks made their living, as there weren't many opportunities in these rural areas. They would take off through the head of Buffalo Creek, the area where many of my ancestors lived and died. Their trip proved worthwhile as they got their shine and began their trip back. Well, by this time, the sun was starting to set low on the horizon. And in these hills, it gets dark much earlier since you're surrounded by mountains. The men came to a shallow part of the Kentucky River. As they needed to cross to get back to their houses, they removed their boots and stepped into the dark, muddy water and began wading until they came to a hole of water that seemed to get rather deep, at least deeper than they were willing to try to cross, and made their way to the other side, taking the shallow part. The men took a seat on the bank of the river to put their boots back on. Milton heard a sound close to them in the deeper part of the river. He turned to my grandfather. "Ed, do you see that?" "Yes," Ed replied. "What the hell is it?" As I mentioned, it was getting dark, and all they could make out was a large, dark, upright figure emerging from the murky water. "Run, Ed!" Milton shouted. Milton had a shotgun, which he kept with him for squirrel hunting and such. "I'll shoot it. You go," said Milton. Well, my grandfather did just that. About 30 seconds later, he heard a shotgun blast and Milton screaming, "Get out of here, Ed! It's got me!" And that's just what he did. He didn't stop running until he got back to his house. Once he got there, he locked the door and looked out his window, watching, waiting for Milton to emerge from the brush. Well, that night, Milton never showed up. Many thoughts ran through my grandfather's head. Did this thing kill Milton? Did it take him somewhere? He didn't know if he would ever see his friend again. Needless to say, he didn't sleep at all that night. Once the sun began to rise, my grandfather noticed a figure crawling from the tree line. After getting a closer look, he knew it was Milton, so he runs to help his friend. He looked like he had been through a horrific experience. His skin was pale white, his clothes ripped and tattered, marks and bruises on his arms, neck, and face. What had he encountered? My grandfather thought to himself. He immediately asked what happened last night. "I'm not allowed to talk about it," replied Milton, in a soft but stern voice. "But that thing," said my grandfather, "what was it?" "Never," shouted Milton. "Never ask me about that again." So my grandfather let it be. Milton never told a soul what happened to him that cold fall night, not even his own son, who asked him on his deathbed. Old Milton took it to his grave. Was he so traumatized by the experience he just never wanted to take himself back to the moment? Or is it something else? Did some creature threaten him in some way as to never talk about it, or there could have been consequences you and I may never understand? I wish my grandfather was still alive today to share the story himself, but hopefully I did the story justice. What do you guys think they encountered? A cryptid? A demon? Maybe something completely explainable, but I highly doubt it. My grandfather spent his entire life in those hills, so I highly doubt he would misidentify an animal for a cryptid. And besides, What kind of animal makes bubbles in the water before walking upright out of a river? I know I've never heard of such a thing. I hope you've enjoyed this story, as it has always been one of my favorites my grandfather would tell me growing up. If you did, please subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and share. Until next time, this is Ashley with Hill Shadows.